On his deathbed, Ethan Caldwell lay surrounded by the hum of machines, memories of a long, lonely life flashing before him. 60 years had passed since he'd walked out of Clara's life, leaving her with nothing but broken promises. His wrinkled hand gripped an old pocket watch she once gave him, a token of a love he destroyed. With his final breaths, he whispered her name. A surge of light engulfed him, and when his eyes opened, he was young again, standing outside Clara's door in 1961. Ethan Caldwell lay motionless on his hospital bed, the rhythmic hum of machines filling the silence. At 87 years old, his body was frail, but his mind, though clouded by time, was sharp enough to hold a single, relentless regret. Clara. Her name had haunted him for 6 decades, a ghost tethered to every failure, every hollow success. In his hand, he clutched an antique pocket watch she had given him when their love still felt unbreakable. Now it was a relic of his failure. The watch's ticking grew louder. Ethan's breath caught as the sterile hospital room dissolved into a swirl of color and sound. The beeping monitors faded, replaced by the distant roar of passing cars and the chatter of voices. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the faint tang of exhaust. Disoriented, Ethan looked down at his hands, young and steady, free of the marks of time. A nearby shop window reflected a face he hadn't seen in decades, his 25-year-old self. This was no dream. Time had rewound itself, thrusting him back into the year 1961. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He wasn't here to relive his youth. He was here to face his past, to face Clara. Ethan found himself wandering familiar streets, each turn pulling him deeper into memories long buried. The park where they had shared stolen moments of joy was still vibrant, its trees awash with autumn hues. The corner store where they'd planned future road trips still stood, the weight of nostalgia mixed with the crushing awareness of the pain he had caused. Before long, his steps brought him to her apartment building, unchanged by the years. He stood at her door, the sound of his heartbeat drowning out the ticking of the watch. How many times had he dreamed of this moment? He had rehearsed his words countless times, but now they felt meaningless. With trembling fingers, he knocked. The door opened, and there she was, Clara. Her auburn hair framed her youthful face, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, and Ethan was overwhelmed by the weight of what he had lost. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice uncertain. He nodded, his throat dry. "It's me." Her expression shifted, the warmth of recognition giving way to something colder. Pain. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara stepped back, crossing her arms. "After all this time? What could you possibly have to say?" Ethan faltered. The words he had practiced felt hollow. "I wanted to tell you how sorry I am. For everything." Her eyes narrowed. "You left, Ethan. You didn't just leave. You disappeared. Do you know what that did to me?" "I know," he said quickly. "I've carried that guilt every day." Clara laughed bitterly. "Guilt? Is that what brought you here? You think apologizing will undo what you did?" "No," Ethan admitted, "but I had to try." She shook her head, her expression unreadable. "You should leave." The door closed, leaving Ethan alone in the hallway. The silence was deafening. He stared at the door, his heart heavy with the weight of rejection. This wasn't going to be simple, and maybe he didn't deserve for it to be. Ethan stood frozen outside Clara's door, her parting words echoing in his mind. "You should leave." The rejection stung, though he had expected it. How could a few words undo 60 years of regret? He gripped the pocket watch in his hand, its ticking steady, a cruel reminder of the fleeting time he had been given. Leaving wasn't an option, not this time. The streets of his youth were alive with the sounds of 1961, children laughing, bicycles clattering over cobblestones, and the faint hum of life moving on. Ethan wandered aimlessly. the weight of his guilt growing heavier with every step. Each familiar sight reminded him of the life he had abandoned: the park where he and Clara had once spent afternoons, the diner they frequented, and the corner where he had first told her he loved her. Eventually, his steps carried him to the park. The old wooden bench where they had shared countless moments still stood, weathered but intact. Ethan sat, his head bowed, the cool wood pressing against his palms. He let himself remember the last time he saw Clara, her tear-filled eyes begging him to stay as he walked away. "I'll come back," he had promised. He never did. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Still here?" Clara stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her expression guarded. Ethan rose to meet her gaze. "I am," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not leaving until I make this right." Clara's eyes narrowed. "You think you can just show up after all these years and fix things?" Her voice was sharp, but beneath the anger, Ethan saw the shadow of the pain he had caused. "I don't think I can fix anything," he admitted, "but I needed to try. You deserve to hear the truth." "The truth?" Clara laughed bitterly. "The truth is, you left me. You disappeared without a word. I spent years wondering what I did wrong." Ethan's throat tightened. "It wasn't you, Clara. It was me. I thought I had to become someone important, someone worthy of you. But I see now that I was a coward." Clara sat down on the bench, keeping a careful distance. "You don't know what it was like for me, Ethan. I waited for you. For years, I waited. And when I finally moved on, I couldn't trust anyone. How could I?" "I understand," Ethan said softly. "I don't expect forgiveness. But I needed to tell you. You were the best part of my life, and I threw it away. That's a mistake I'll carry for the rest of my days." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken pain. Clara finally stood, brushing off her skirt. "Words don't fix anything, Ethan. If you're serious about this, prove it." Ethan nodded, determination flaring in his chest. "I will, whatever it takes." Clara didn't respond, but as she walked away, Ethan caught a flicker of something in her expression. Hope, perhaps. He sank back onto the bench, staring at the pocket watch in his hand. Its ticking seemed louder now, a constant reminder of the time he couldn't afford to waste. Ethan began each day with renewed purpose, though Clara's words echoed in his mind. Prove it. How could he undo decades of pain? The ticking of the pocket watch in his hand was a constant reminder. His time was limited. Each second that passed felt like a weight pressing down on him, urging him to act before it was too late. He returned to the diner where Clara worked, lingering at a quiet corner table, unsure if she'd even acknowledge him. At first she didn't, but her quick glances betrayed her awareness of his presence. Ethan made himself a fixture in the diner, appearing every day and staying until closing time. It was subtle, helping to sweep the floors, fixing the creaky door that annoyed the staff, or ensuring the counters were wiped spotless before the next day. Clara rarely acknowledged his efforts, but Ethan persisted. Each act was his way of saying, "I'm here, and I won't walk away again." One evening, after the last customer left, Clara finally confronted him. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked, crossing her arms as he wiped down the counter. "Is this about guilt?" "Partly," Ethan admitted, setting the cloth aside. "But it's more than that. I ran because I thought I needed to be better to deserve you. Now, I just want to be better for you." Clara's eyes softened for a moment before her defenses returned. "It's not that simple, Ethan. You can't just fix this with a mop and some sweet words." "I know it's not simple," he said quietly, "and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I'll keep trying, Clara. As long as I have time, I'll keep trying." Her silence was heavy. She turned and walked away without another word. Yet even in her retreat, Ethan felt a flicker of hope, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. Later, as they walked toward her apartment after another shift, Clara broke the silence. "Do you remember this corner?" she asked, gesturing to a flickering lamppost. Ethan nodded. "It was the night I told you I was leaving. The night I made the worst mistake of my life." Clara stopped, staring at the ground. "I begged you to stay, but you didn't even look back." Ethan's throat tightened. "I've regretted that every day since." Clara's voice wavered. "Why wasn't I enough?" "You were more than enough," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I was too scared to see it. I thought I needed to become someone important, but none of it mattered without you." The night air was cold, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic. Finally, Clara sighed. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Ethan. But I don't hate you anymore. That's something." "It's more than I deserve," Ethan said softly. "Thank you." Clara nodded but didn't respond. As she disappeared into her building, Ethan remained beneath the flickering lamppost, clutching the pocket watch. Its steady ticking was louder now, a reminder that time was slipping away. But as he stood there, he resolved to make every second count, to show Clara, not just with words, but with actions, that he could be the man she once believed in. The watch ticked on, but for the first time in decades, Ethan felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Ethan's days fell into a rhythm. Each morning, the ticking of the pocket watch reminded him that time was slipping away. By the time the diner opened, he was already there, sweeping floors, fixing creaky doors, and helping in quiet ways. Clara remained distant, her words sharp and her eyes cautious, but Ethan understood. Trust would take time. On a quiet afternoon, Ethan noticed Clara sketching in a corner booth. He approached cautiously. "I didn't know you still sketched," he said. Clara didn't look up. "What do you want, Ethan?" "I just remembered how much you loved it," he replied. "You always said you wanted to paint the world the way you saw it." Her hand paused briefly. "That was a long time ago." "It doesn't have to be," Ethan said softly. "You were always talented." Clara glanced at him, her expression unreadable before returning to her work. She said nothing more, but over the following days, Ethan saw her sketching more often. Though she rarely spoke to him, her subtle smiles when she thought no one was watching told him something was shifting. One evening, after the diner closed, Clara invited Ethan to sit. "You've been here every day," she said. "Why?" "You know why," Ethan replied. "I'm trying to show you I've changed." Clara studied him. "People don't change that easily." "I know," Ethan said, "but I've spent 60 years wishing I could tell you how much you meant to me." Clara's gaze dropped to her hands, faintly smudged with charcoal. "I don't know if I can believe you yet." "That's fair," Ethan said, "but I'm not going anywhere." Her slight nod was a breakthrough. As days passed, she began to lower her walls, if only slightly. She sketched more freely, her conversations less guarded. Ethan noticed her stolen glances, the faint cracks in her armor. Each small step forward was a victory. One evening, as they walked toward her apartment, Clara broke the silence. "Do you remember this corner?" she asked, gesturing to a flickering lamppost. Ethan nodded. "It was the night I told you I was leaving. My worst mistake." Clara stopped, staring at the ground. "I begged you to stay," she said, "but you didn't even look back." "I've regretted that every day since," Ethan said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Why wasn't I enough?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "You were more than enough," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I was too scared to see it. I thought I needed to be someone important, but none of it mattered without you." The night air was cold, the only sound the hum of distant traffic. Finally, Clara sighed. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Ethan, but I don't hate you anymore." Ethan felt a pang of relief. "It's more than I deserve," he said softly. Clara nodded and disappeared into her building. Ethan remained beneath the flickering lamppost, clutching the pocket watch. Its ticking grew louder, a reminder of the time slipping through his fingers. But for the first time in decades, he felt hope, a fragile but tangible thing. Redemption wasn't easy, but it was worth every step. Ethan woke each morning with urgency, the pocket watch ticking louder as time slipped away. Yet, for the first time in decades, he felt a fragile hope. Clara no longer looked at him with disdain, though her guarded demeanor remained. Her faint smiles while sketching or the moments she lingered during conversations told him that something was shifting. One afternoon, Ethan overheard Clara speaking to a regular at the diner. "You're still sketching?" the older woman asked. Clara hesitated. "A little, just for myself." "You used to dream of showing your work," the woman said. "You always had such talent." Clara's glance toward Ethan was unreadable. That was a long time ago. Ethan felt the sting of regret. He had once discouraged Clara's dreams, too absorbed in his own ambitions to see her sacrifices. That evening, as they walked home, he addressed it. "Clara, have you thought about showing your sketches again?" "Why would I?" she asked, surprised. "That part of my life is over." "It doesn't have to be," Ethan said. "You're still as talented as ever." Clara's expression softened briefly. "It's not that simple, Ethan. Dreams like that need time and money. And who would care?" "I would," Ethan said firmly. "I always did. I just didn't know how to show it." Clara looked down, her voice low. "You were chasing your dreams back then. There was no room for mine." "You're right," Ethan admitted. "But your dreams mattered, Clara. They still do." For a moment, she was silent. Then, softly, she said, "It's been so long. I wouldn't even know where to start." "Start with me," Ethan said. "Let me help." Clara didn't answer, but her slight nod gave Ethan hope. The next day, he acted. While Clara worked her shift, he bought sketching supplies and left them on her usual booth with a note. "For the world you see, and the one you can create." When Clara found the gift, she was silent. Ethan watched nervously as she ran her fingers over the sketchpad's cover. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because I believe in you," Ethan said simply. Clara didn't reject the gift. Instead, she kept it close, her guardedness softening. That small acceptance felt like a turning point. In the following days, Ethan noticed Clara sketching more frequently. She still kept her distance, but he could see her confidence returning. Occasionally, she would glance at him while she worked, her expression less guarded. Ethan dared to believe that, slowly, she was beginning to trust him. That night, as Ethan walked home under the autumn sky, the watch's ticking echoed in his ears. Time was finite, but he allowed himself to hope. Clara had accepted his gesture, and redemption, though distant, felt within reach. The weeks passed with a quiet, steady rhythm. Ethan's presence at the diner had become an unspoken part of the routine. Though the other staff exchanged polite nods or warm greetings, it was Clara's subtle shifts that held his focus. Her guarded demeanor remained, but she sketched more often now, sometimes in the diner, sometimes outside during her breaks. Her walls hadn't crumbled, but there were cracks, glimpses of the person she had been before he left. One crisp afternoon, Ethan found Clara sitting on a bench near the park, her sketchpad balanced on her knees. From a distance, he watched as her pencil moved with precision, capturing the scene before her. A group of children playing with a kite, their laughter carried on the breeze. Hesitant, Ethan approached, unsure if his presence would be welcome. Clara glanced up as he neared, her expression neutral. "You don't always have to follow me, you know," she said lightly. "I wasn't following," Ethan replied, offering a small smile. "But if I'm intruding, I can leave." Clara shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Stay if you want. Just don't distract me." Ethan sat beside her, careful to keep his distance. He watched her work, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the graceful movement of her hand across the page. For a moment, he was transported back in time, remembering how her sketches used to be her escape, her passion. He had taken that joy for granted. "Why did you stop?" he asked softly. Clara's pencil paused mid-stroke. "Life got in the way," she said. "You left. After that, everything else felt small." Ethan's chest tightened. "I never wanted to take that from you." "But you did," Clara said plainly. Her focus returned to the sketch. "But I suppose I let you." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustling of leaves and the laughter from the children in the park. Finally, Clara set her pencil down and turned to him. "Why are you really here, Ethan? Why now?" He met her gaze, the weight of her question heavy. "Because I couldn't leave this life without trying to fix what I broke," he admitted. "You deserved better, and I see that now." Clara studied him, her expression unreadable. "And if I never forgive you, what then?" "I'll still try," Ethan said firmly, "because you deserve the effort, even if it doesn't change anything." For the first time, Clara seemed to relax, her shoulders softening slightly. She didn't reply, but she didn't push him away either. Instead, she picked up her sketch pad and resumed drawing. Ethan stayed beside her, grateful for the chance to simply be there. That evening, as they walked back toward her apartment, Clara handed him the sketch she had been working on. It was the children with the kite, their joy captured perfectly on the page. "Here," she said. "I don't usually give my sketches away, but maybe you'll appreciate this one." Ethan took the drawing, his hands trembling slightly. "It's beautiful," he said. "Thank you." Clara nodded, her expression softening. "Don't lose it," she said before disappearing into her building. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, the sketch in one hand and the pocket watch in the other. The ticking seemed louder than ever, a reminder of borrowed time. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for Clara, but for himself. He tucked the sketch carefully into his pocket and began the walk home, the crunch of autumn leaves beneath his feet. The days after Ethan's confession were quiet, heavy with uncertainty. Clara kept her distance, her walls seemingly rebuilt. Ethan didn't regret telling her the truth, but he wondered if he had done it too soon. Despite her retreat, he continued his quiet acts of care, cleaning the diner, leaving fresh flowers at her booth, and supporting her sketches. Clara didn't reject him outright, but her responses were muted, and her warmth had receded. One evening, as the diner emptied, Clara broke the silence. "I don't know what to do with what you told me," she said. "It's too much." Ethan nodded. "I don't expect you to believe it all at once. I just needed you to know." "Why now?" she asked, frowning. "Because I've wasted too much time already," he replied simply. Clara didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection. The following weekend, Clara invited Ethan to help rearrange her apartment. "It's just furniture," she said casually, but for Ethan it was monumental. Her space was a reflection of her, warm and understated. As they moved bookshelves and adjusted her desk, Clara relaxed. She even laughed at one point, the sound filling Ethan with hope. "I've been thinking about what you said," Clara admitted during a break, "about the second chance." Ethan's heart raced. "And?" "I don't know if I believe it," she said carefully, "but I see you're trying. That matters." "It does," Ethan said earnestly. Clara hesitated before handing him her sketch pad. "I've been working on something. It's not finished." Ethan opened the pad and saw a drawing of the two of them sitting on their usual park bench. The detail was stunning, capturing the tenderness of a shared moment. Ethan was struck silent. "It's beautiful," he said at last. "You're incredible." "It's just a sketch," Clara said, though her faint blush betrayed her modesty. "It's a piece of you," Ethan replied, "and it's perfect." Clara met his gaze. "I don't know what this is, Ethan, but maybe it's worth figuring out." "It is," Ethan said, "and we'll do it together." They talked late into the evening, sharing memories, regrets, and dreams they had abandoned. For a few precious hours it felt as though they had returned to the people they once were, full of hope and possibility. Clara's guardedness softened further as she opened up about the years they had spent apart, the struggles she had faced, and the lingering wounds of his absence. Ethan listened intently, his heart heavy with regret but filled with determination. As the night deepened, Ethan noticed the weight of the pocket watch pressing against him. Its ticking grew louder, a reminder of the time slipping through his fingers. But in that moment, sitting across from Clara in the quiet of her apartment, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps he was making the most of the time he had left. When he left her apartment, Ethan paused outside her door, his hand brushing the watch. Its sound was insistent, a reminder that his journey was far from over. Yet, for the first time, he allowed himself to feel hope. Redemption wasn't a destination. It was a series of small, deliberate steps, and with Clara, he was beginning to take them. Ethan could feel the shift. Clara wasn't fully open, but there was a softness in her demeanor, a tentative willingness to let him remain in her life. Each shared moment felt precious, yet the pocket watch ticked louder each day, reminding him that his borrowed time was running out. One autumn afternoon, Clara invited Ethan to the park. It was the same park where they had spent afternoons in their youth. As they walked, Clara carried her sketch pad. They settled on a bench near the duck pond. She sketched in silence while Ethan watched the sunlight ripple on the water. "What do you see when you look at this place?" Clara asked suddenly. Ethan hesitated. "I see memories," he said. "The dreams we had, the promises we made." "And now?" Clara asked. "Now I see hope," Ethan replied softly. "Because we're here again, together." Clara didn't respond, but her faint smile told him his words had reached her. As weeks passed, Clara began to let Ethan into more corners of her life. She spoke of the years they spent apart, the pain of his absence, the struggles she faced, and the strength she had found. Ethan listened, his heart heavy with regret but full of admiration for her resilience. One evening, Clara showed Ethan a collection of sketches she had kept hidden. They were stunning, portraits and landscapes imbued with raw emotion. "These are incredible," Ethan said. "Why have you kept them hidden?" "They weren't meant for anyone else," Clara replied. "I didn't think they mattered." "They matter to me," Ethan said, "and they'd matter to others too." Clara hesitated but didn't dismiss his words. Over the following days, she sketched with renewed passion. Ethan saw glimpses of the dreamer she had once been. She worked with focus and intensity, as if reconnecting with a part of herself she thought she had lost. But the pocket watch's ticking grew louder. Late one night, Ethan sat alone, staring at its glowing face, wondering how much time remained. The weight of it pressed on him, but he resolved to make every moment count. The next morning, Ethan suggested taking Clara to an art gallery in a nearby town. She hesitated but agreed. "You've spent so much time supporting others," he said. "Let someone inspire you." The gallery was small but elegant, its walls adorned with contemporary and classic works. Clara wandered the halls, her eyes wide with awe. Ethan stayed close but gave her space to explore. At one point she paused before a charcoal piece depicting an empty bench beneath a tree. The stillness of it seemed to resonate. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "So is your work," Ethan said. "You could have a place like this one day." Clara turned to him, vulnerable. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Ethan replied. "You just have to believe it, too." As they left the gallery, Clara clutched her sketch pad tightly, her steps lighter. Something had shifted within her. A spark of belief reignited. That evening, as they sat in the park, Clara spoke softly. "Thank you, Ethan." for believing in me." "You've always been worth believing in," Ethan replied, though his heart ached. The pocket watch ticked louder, a reminder of the inevitable. But for the first time, Ethan felt he was using his time wisely. Ethan awoke to the relentless ticking of the pocket watch. Its steady rhythm had become both a comfort and a torment, a reminder of the fleeting time he had left. Each moment with Clara felt more precious, but the weight of the watch pressed heavier each day. At the diner that afternoon, Clara seemed lighter, her demeanor more relaxed. She even laughed at one of Ethan's clumsy jokes, a sound that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. They worked side by side, their conversations carrying a warmth they hadn't shared in years. "I've been thinking about the gallery," Clara said suddenly, "and about what you said." Ethan paused, his heart skipping a beat. "What about it?" Clara hesitated, then spoke with quiet determination. "I want to try. Maybe just one piece." Ethan's chest swelled with pride. "That's wonderful, Clara. You'll be amazing." "Don't get ahead of yourself," she replied, though her faint smile betrayed her own excitement. In the days that followed, Clara poured herself into her work. Ethan marveled at her focus, the way she seemed to lose herself in the act of creation. Watching her rediscover this part of herself was like seeing the person he had fallen in love with re-emerge. Yet, as her sketches grew, the ticking of the watch grew louder, an ever-present reminder that time was slipping away. One evening, as they walked through the park, Clara brought her sketch pad. She stopped at their usual bench and handed it to Ethan. "I've been working on something," she said, her tone uncertain. Ethan opened the pad to see a drawing of them sitting on the bench, framed by autumn leaves. The details were vivid: the slope of Clara's shoulders, the tilt of Ethan's head. It was a moment suspended in time, captured with breathtaking tenderness. "It's incredible," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've captured so much. It's beautiful." Clara looked away, her expression modest but pleased. "It's not finished yet, but I wanted you to see it." Ethan's voice was soft. "I'm honored. Truly." They sat in silence, the quiet broken only by rustling leaves. But even as Ethan cherished the moment, the ticking of the watch grew louder. "Clara," Ethan began, his voice hesitant, "there's something I haven't told you." She turned to him, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, the weight of his confession pressing heavily. "The pocket watch. It's counting down. I don't know how much time I have left, but it's running out." Clara stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Ethan, what are you saying?" "I don't know how I got this second chance," Ethan said, "but I had to use it to make things right with you." Tears shimmered in Clara's eyes. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I didn't want this to be about the time I have left," Ethan said. "I wanted it to be about the time we've shared." Clara's gaze softened, but her hands tightened around her sketch pad. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," Ethan replied gently. "Just know every moment with you has been worth it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in hues of gold and crimson, they sat together in silence. Ethan felt the weight of the watch grow heavier, its ticking relentless. But beside Clara, he allowed himself to hope he had made the most of the time he'd been given. Ethan awoke with a sense of finality. The pocket watch, always a constant presence, seemed heavier than ever. Its ticking echoed in his mind, each beat a reminder that this might be the day his borrowed time ended. Yet he felt strangely calm. He had come back for a purpose, and he had fulfilled it as best he could. That afternoon, Clara suggested they visit the park one last time before the weather turned colder. She carried her sketch pad, and they walked in companionable silence. The leaves had begun to fall in earnest, carpeting the paths in gold and rust. The crisp air carried the scent of earth and impending winter. When they reached their bench, Clara began sketching while Ethan watched the ducks glide across the pond. He felt the pocket watch's weight pressing against him, its ticking louder than ever. He knew it was time to tell her everything. "Clara," he said softly, breaking the stillness. She looked up, her pencil pausing. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, then took the pocket watch from his coat. Its face glowed faintly in the fading light. "This watch," he said, "is why I'm here. It brought me back, gave me this time with you." Clara frowned. "I don't understand." "It's counting down," Ethan explained. "When it stops, so do I. I don't know how or why, but this watch gave me a second chance to make things right with you." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want this to be about the time I had left," Ethan said. "I wanted it to be about the time we shared." Clara reached for his hand, her grip firm. "You've changed, Ethan. I see it. You're not the man who left." "I had to change," Ethan said. "This chance, it's more than I deserved." They sat in silence, the only sound the rustling leaves and the watches ticking. Finally, Clara spoke. "You've given me something, too. You made me believe in myself again." Ethan smiled. "You've always had it in you. I just reminded you." As the sun dipped lower, the watch's ticking grew fainter. Clara seemed to sense it, too. "Ethan?" she whispered. He turned to her, his smile soft but resolute. "Thank you, Clara, for forgiving me." "I'll never forget you," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to," Ethan replied. "I'll always be here, with you." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the watch ticked one final time and fell silent. Ethan closed his eyes, his hand still clasped in Clara's. A profound stillness settled over him, and he was gone. Clara sat there for a long time, her tears falling freely. In her lap, the pocket watch lay still, its glow extinguished. She opened her sketchpad and stared at her unfinished drawing, a portrait of Ethan, his expression full of quiet resolve. With trembling hands, she finished it, adding the final lines as stars began to appear in the night sky. Years later, Clara's work hung in galleries, celebrated far and wide, but one piece she never sold, the drawing of Ethan, sitting beside her on that bench. It remained with her always, a reminder of the man who had returned to seek forgiveness and had given her back her dreams.